Our story for today comes from the 6th chapter of 2 Kings. There are three characters I want you to pay attention to. There's the king of Aram, who's located in where Syria would now be. There's the prophet of Israel, who's in a place called Dothan. And then there's the king of Israel, who is located in Samaria, which is where his garrison is, where his military headquarters. And so this is a lovely story from 2 Kings. Once, when the king of Aram was at war with Israel, he held a council with his officers. And he said, "At such and such a place shall be my camp. But over in Israel, the man of God sent word to the king of Israel, don't pass by such and such a place, because the Arameans are going down there." So the king sent word to this place more than once or twice. He sent word to such a place so that they were on alert. The mind of the king of Aram was greatly perturbed because of this. And he said to his officers, "Who among us sides with Israel?" And one of them said, "No one, my lord. King, it's Elisha, the prophet over in Israel. He takes what you say and repeats it to the king of Israel, even the things you say in your bedchamber." The king of Aram said, "Go and find him so that I might seek and seize him." And the king was told, "Well, he's in Dothan." So the king sent horses and chariots and a great army. And they went by night and they surrounded the city. When the servant of the man of God rose early in the morning and he looked, he saw horses and chariots on every side. And he said, "Oh, what'll we do? What'll we do?" And Elisha said, "Don't be afraid. There's more of us than there are of them." And the man of God prayed, "O Lord, open his eyes, please." And the Lord opened his eyes, and he saw that the mountain was filled with horses and chariots of fire. When the Arameans came out against the man of God, he again prayed, "O Lord, strike them with a blinding light." And so the Lord struck them with a blinding light. And Elisha went to them and said, "Oh, no, this isn't the place. This isn't the city you seek. Follow me, and I will take you to the man you seek." And so he took them to Samaria, where the king of Israel's garrison was. And when they entered Samaria, the man of God prayed, "Lord, open their eyes." And the Lord opened their eyes, and they saw that they were in Samaria, right in the king's garrison. And the king of Israel said, Father, shall I kill him? Shall I kill him?" And Elisha said, "Was it by your sword or bow that they were captured? No. Feed them, give them water, and when they've eaten and drunk, send them back to their master." So the king prepared prepared a great feast. And once they had eaten and drunk, he sent them to their master. And the Arameans came raiding in Israel no longer. This is the story of our people.
Hi there. Today's edition of Biblical Storytelling Bible Story comes from 2 Samuel, and Phil was a storyteller, so he'll do an introduction for us.
This story speaks of one of the great prophets among the people of Israel, Elisha, and it happens as Israel is having ongoing conflicts, ongoing war with the people of Aram, and so that's the larger context that the story takes place in. I think that's enough for now.
I just want to remind you that there are two prophets with very similar names in these books of the Kings. One is Elijah with a J at the end, J-A-H, and his name means God, Yahweh is my God. And the one we're hearing about today is Elisha, who was a student of Elijah. He was the successor. And his name means God is salvation. So in English, we don't always hear the distinction between the two, but this is the later prophet named Elisha. So, yeah, who is now, we actually, I think, have more stories about Elisha in 2 Kings, but we're not always as familiar with him, I think. One of the things that I noticed in this story today is when the servant thinks that they're in trouble because all of these other the Arameans have surrounded their camp, and the servant kind of panics because he just thinks they're doomed because they're surrounded. And Elisha can see God's army that's surrounding the Aramean army, the chariots and horses of fire, and the servant can't see them. And so I was really struck by the unique position that Elisha is in as the man of God, as a prophet, to be able to see things, to see what God is doing that other people can't see. And I also think that it's not only Elisha who can do that, right? But that just because of the way he lives his life and is in tune with God, he is tuned into what God is doing. And so he maybe has different expectations for how God's going to show up in the world. And so he can see that because that's what he expects God to see. And also this story emphasizes for me the importance of prayer, for asking God, I need to see this. I need to know what's going on. I need to know what you want me to do, God. And so he prays a couple times in the story, and it really makes a difference in how the story, what happens in the story because of his prayers. And I think those are both things that we, that I sure can hold on to a little bit more tightly, and things that we can practice. We're not prophets necessarily, but even normal people like us can see what God is doing in the world if we practice seeing what God is doing in the world.
There's actually three moments at least, I'm running through my head, where he's able to see things that others don't see. So in the beginning, God is communicating to him. He's not in the same place as either the king of Israel or the king of Aram, and yet he knows the battle plans and is able to communicate them to the king of Israel, avoiding conflicts that might otherwise happen. And then in the story, as you pointed out, he sees the chariots of fire, which, as we're in the midst of Olympic times, there was a movie when we were growing up that was called Chariots of Fire, and it draws on this story and about seeing spiritual powers when other people don't see them. So I hear the music of that playing in my head. But then at the end, he sees a way out of the conflicts, and says, no, we're not going to continue the cycle of violence of enemies fighting against each other. We're going to set a table before our enemies and feed them. And so in that moment too, he sees something that others don't see, and it's always linked to this relationship with God he has that provides him that vision.
And that's such a turnaround from what we too often expect and find in some of these stories, that that there's a prayer for God to save them from their enemies, or even to kill all their enemies so that the
Mm.
Israelites can win. And that's not what happens in this. Well, the Israelites win, but not by killing all their enemies. So what do you know any other stories where this happens, or why do you think this is such a, it's kind of a unique story, I think?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the the story that my mind immediately goes to is the Last Supper, where Jesus knows these are the ones who are going to betray him, are going to abandon him, and he sets a meal before them and tells them, not only I'm feeding you now, but you should do this always, as though I know what's coming. I'm even going to tell, he tells them explicitly what's going to happen, and says, but this meal's for you so that after you have gone as wrong as you could go, know that I will come back to you, because I'm wanting to feed you. I'm wanting to give you bread. I'm wanting to give you wine, as happens in this story. That's the place my mind goes. And then the Psalm 23, where God says, God set a table before me in the presence of my enemies, or David says, God set a table before me in the presence of my enemies. And that it often in the past, I've imagined that means finally, God's going to set a nice table for me, and my enemies are going to have to watch me eating. They'll be honored and they won't be. But if you think about it in terms of this story, it's God's going to bring us to a place where we're happy to sit down at table with those who had been our enemies. It's a totally, and I think this story anticipates that as a New Testament theme, and then also resonates with that psalm in interesting ways, opens up the psalm in ways I wouldn't otherwise hear it.
Yeah, it's interesting to me that the solution to whatever the problem is, I don't even know what they're fighting over at this point, if they're fighting over boundaries or territory or what, but the solution to the problem is to have a meal together, not to kill each other. And I know that sounds kind of simplistic, but I wonder how many times in our world is the solution to some conflict having a meal together and caring for one another in this way, rather than making someone's life more miserable. Right?
Right.
I mean, it reminds me of reconciliation work that I know people have done, like with perpetrators of violence who are, in prison, and the surviving family of the ones that they killed, and the reconciliation work that happens there, and how much more powerful that is and liberating for both sides, instead of just letting one get what they deserve by being in prison and the other ones are still miserable. Right. So it's a very creative solution, I think, and I don't think we try it often enough. But the communion table, as you pointed out, is one place for me that not only theologically but practically people come and are at the same table for when we take communion together. And it's usually a combination of people that would never gather together for any other reason, right? We don't necessarily have a lot of things in common. We're not necessarily friends around that table. And there might even be people we think of as enemies or people that we avoid around that table. And yet at this table, we all belong to God and to one another as the body of Christ together. So this story is a really nice image, I think, of the power of relationship and maybe food for healing rather than for keeping us apart.
I have a friend that I was just talking to. I was hearing him talk, I should say, this week in a group. He's writing a book about the Lord's Prayer, and his vision is it's a prayer for reconciliation. And he said, we have fights every day over our daily bread. And the daily bread is whatever it is, land, my rights versus your rights, that we fight for. And he said, the Lord's Prayer, which is known by millions of people around the world, is a prayer of reconciliation, where we begin by recognizing we have the same source, our Father, right? And that changes the way we perceive our bread. We see the bread as something to share, and not something to fight over. I'm wondering if, as you're somebody who works in a campus ministry position, like mentoring seems to be really important here. And I wonder if that resonates with the ministry that you do, that there's this person who's got this ongoing relationship with God and has had it for years, has been mentored by other people into that. And then he is able to help the younger one who's filled with fear in this moment of overwhelming crisis, which we all understand in varying levels at different times. He is able to open that one up to see what he couldn't see on his own. I wonder if you experience that, if that's what happens in campus ministry, and like if there's examples of that occur to you. Or
Yeah, and I think not only just with me as the pastor, but even with students, what we do is walk alongside each other, and we bring what we have and who we are to these relationships. So that's one of the things I love about campus ministry, is how many different relationships get formed, and again, across lines. Like, it's not all people from the same major or who necessarily know each other outside of our campus ministry, but they become good friends within our campus ministry. And so that kind of diversity and accompaniment along the way, as we are figuring out who God has made us to be, who we are. And I'm not done with that work myself. It's a lifelong task, I think. And to be able to share with one another where we see God working in our lives or in this world around us, that's how we learn. And I think that's how we practice praying. We practice seeing where God is, and we learn that from one another. So it's not, in the story, it's a little bit about Elisha being an expert because he was chosen by God for this work, showing the servant. But at the end, I think this is really important. Elisha also tells the king, right? The king's the one who says, oh, good, they're all here. Easy target. I can kill them all. And Elisha is the one who tells even the king, this is what God wants you to do. So it's not really about rank and who knows more or who knows less, but how are we all in this together and looking at what is the greater good, and how God is calling us together to be God's people in the world.
Yeah. I think of, there have been some mentors I've had that have, they've come with me with the territory, right? So like I had a doctoral advisor that had a profound impact on me. And there are ones, it just seems like we were just the right people to be together at the right time, and shaped each other. I feel like I should do the Mr. Rogers. Now we're just going to take 30 seconds, and everybody, I want you to think about the people who have loved you as you are and allowed you to become the people you are. And he did that with like some pretty high-powered groups, and it's fascinating to watch these really influential people in our society tear up as they remember they didn't get there on their own, that they've walked with lots of other people. And there's a documentary about him that's very moving, and that's the last part, you watch all these people remembering the people who made them who they were, and tearing up.
And biblically, we talk about that as being surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses, right? Yeah. So the people who are here with us, but people from our past who have influenced us, people from way back in the past that we never even knew, but who helped shape the world that we live in and know today. Biblical people who still are shaping how we understand how God is in the world. So yeah, that's great. Well, thanks for joining us today for this story. We'll see you again next time.